Hi, welcome to Dust History. Imagine walking into a room where everyone smells like sweat, sewage, and rotting teeth. Welcome to 18th century Europe. This was a world without deodorant, without toothpaste as we know it, and without the modern obsession with bathing. It was a place where the idea of cleanliness meant something very different from what we imagine today. And for the people who lived then, smell was not just an inconvenience, it was a fact of life, an invisible cloud that clung to their bodies, their homes, and even their streets. When we think of the 1700s, we imagine powdered wigs, shimmering gowns, elegant soirees in candlelit halls, and powdered faces smiling behind silk fans. But hidden beneath the glamour was an odor that modern noses would find unbearable. The perfume, the powder, the lace, all of it was less about fashion and more about survival. Not against disease necessarily, but against smell itself. For the truth is simple, the world reeked. Perfume. Covering the filth, not removing it. Let's start with perfume. Today, we spritz a little cologne or dab some perfume to add a pleasant scent. In the 1700s, it was a shield, a mask, a weapon in the constant war against human odor. Imagine not bathing for weeks at a time. Imagine your clothes absorbing every drop of sweat, every trace of your environment, until they became a living record of your scent. Washing garments was dangerous for delicate fabrics and time-consuming, so people simply didn't do it often. Instead, they relied on perfume. Perfume in the 18th century wasn't just a dab on the wrists. It was soaked into handkerchiefs, sprayed onto wigs, rubbed into gloves, sprinkled over sheets, and even poured onto pets. Wealthy men and women carried perfumed pouches to sniff when the streets became unbearable, pressing scented linen to their faces as they passed through the stench of the city. In fact, perfume bottles were as common an accessory as a pocket watch or fan. But perfume didn't make things clean. It didn't remove the source of the odor. It only layered something floral or musky on top of the rot. Imagine trying to cover a heap of spoiled meat with roses. You don't erase the smell. You just create a strange, nauseating combination. Visitors to Versailles and London courts often wrote about the suffocating atmosphere of competing perfumes clashing with the body odors beneath them. What people thought was sophistication, to us, would be a nightmare of overpowering fragrance and unwashed bodies. The culture of rare bathing. Why didn't people simply bathe more? Because in the 1700s, bathing was thought to be dangerous. Doctors warned that immersing the body in hot water could weaken the skin, open the pores, and allow disease to creep inside. Bathing was not a daily ritual. It was rare, sometimes annual, sometimes only done for medical necessity. At most, the wealthy might sponge themselves with linen cloths or dab cologne onto their skin, but a full bath was a rare indulgence. In Paris, there were still bathhouses, remnants of Roman tradition, but they were not places of health. They were considered dens of sin and infection. By the mid-18th century, many bathhouses had been closed, and public washing was associated more with immorality than with cleanliness. Water was something to drink, not something to immerse yourself in. And so, layer upon layer of dirt, sweat, and natural oils clung to skin, sometimes for months. The smell of the human body was everywhere. In palaces, courtiers stood shoulder to shoulder for hours in packed halls, the heat of candles and bodies combining into a fog of sweat, perfume, and breath. In cities, the poor had no chance of bathing at all, and their stench was simply another note in the city's chaotic symphony of smace. Alas, the smell of everyday life. The strangest thing about this to us is that people accepted it. The human nose adapts quickly, and when everyone stank, no one noticed. Letters from travelers, however, give us glimpses into the shock outsiders felt when they first entered European cities or courts. Foreign visitors often described Europe as a place where the air itself seems heavy with humanity. For those of us who live in a world of daily showers, soaps, toothpastes, and detergents, It's almost impossible to imagine what it must have been like to step into a crowded ballroom in 1750, where every movement stirred up a different odor. Perfume, then, wasn't a luxury. It was survival. The nobleman, drenched in musk, was not trying to impress with his taste. He was fighting for dominance over the stench of sweat and rot. The lady with roses in her wig was not merely stylish. She was hiding the sour tang of her scalp, the oils that clung to her hair, and the sweat beneath her silks. This was the foundation of 18th century smell culture, a constant battle between the natural odors of human life and the artificial sweetness of flowers, musk, and spice. But as much as people tried, perfume could not hide everything, and when they opened their mouths to speak, a new horror emerged, the stench of rotting teeth and breath that could wither roses. If perfume was Europe's olfactory mask, then the real rot began inside the mouth. Step closer to a person in the 1700s, and the first thing you might notice wasn't the musk of sweat or the sourness of unwashed clothing. It was the stench of their breath. Rotten teeth and foul-smelling mouths were the silent plague of the century. Why? Because dental hygiene as we know it simply didn't exist. Toothbrushes, in their primitive form, did exist, but they were rare, expensive, and often ineffective. Instead, many people relied on twigs or cloth rags, rubbed with a mixture of salt, soot, or crushed brick to scrub their teeth. Yes, brick dust. And as you might imagine, that did more damage than good, scraping away enamel and leaving teeth vulnerable to decay. The diets of the 18th century didn't help either. The wealthy gorged on sugar imported from colonies, a luxury that rotted their teeth faster than the poor could even dream of. By the time someone reached their 30s, it was not uncommon for their mouths to be riddled with cavities, abscesses, and blackened stumps. And with no concept of bacteria, most people didn't link these issues to hygiene. They simply lived with the agony and the odor. Imagine stepping into a crowded ballroom. Beneath the candlelight, everyone looks glamorous. Silks, brocades, powdered wigs. But as you lean in to converse, the illusion shatters. The gentleman's powdered lips might smell faintly of wine, but mostly of sour rot. The lady's laughter might be sweet to the ear, but her breath could curdle your stomach. Kisses, needless to say, were less a gesture of romance than an act of bravery. Dentistry, too, was a horror show. The barber surgeon was often the one to extract teeth, yanking them out with pliers, without anesthesia, without antiseptics. Infection was common, and the lingering smell of pus and blood added another layer to the century's sen. Sorry nightmare. False teeth were an option for the wealthy, but these prosthetics were often carved from ivory, wood, or, most grotesquely, salvaged from the mouths of the dead. These so-called Waterloo teeth, pulled from fallen soldiers on battlefields, would fill the smiles of Europe's elite for decades. And of course, even these smelled foul, absorbing food and decay like sponges. Bad breath was not just a personal inconvenience, it was a social obstacle. Etiquette manuals of the time even warned against leaning too close in conversation, not for propriety's sake, but because of the unavoidable stink. People chewed cloves, mint, or parsley as a desperate attempt to mask the odor, but these remedies were fleeting, like throwing flowers into a sewer and hoping it would smell like spring. Even royalty could not escape this fate. Queen Elizabeth I, though of an earlier century, famously suffered from blackened, decaying teeth in her later years, a problem that remained just as rampant in the 1700s. Aristocrats with the means for sugar binges often had the worst breath of all. Imagine standing before a monarch who radiates power, wealth, and divine right, but who smells like a festering wound every time they open their mouth. In this way, bad breath became one of the unspoken equalizers of the 18th century. From the poorest peasant to the richest duke, no one could truly escape it. It lingered in courtrooms, parlors, and theaters alike, an invisible presence that haunted every interaction. If the perfume of the 1700s masked the body, the mouth betrayed the truth. So the next time you hear about candlelit dinners, lavish banquets, or whispered affairs in the 18th century, imagine not just the gowns and powdered faces, but the sour, fetid breath that hung between every word and every kiss. It was a century where beauty was performed, not lived, where the senses deceived the eye but never the nose, and this was only the beginning of the century's olfactory horrors. Because if the mouths of Europe smelled rotten, the heads smelled worse. The wigs, the powdered crowns of fashion, were festering nests of their own. If the breath of the 1700s could curl your stomach, the wigs could empty it. Those towering powdered marvels that we see in portraits, the proud curls of aristocrats and judges, were not just symbols of fashion. They were, quite literally, nests of filth. Let's start with the basics. Wigs, or perukes as they were called, were made from human hair, horsehair, or even goat hair. These strands were stitched together, curled, and powdered with flour, starch, or ground white clay. At first glance, it was elegance incarnate, cascading curls, frosted with powder, dusted with lavender or orange-scented oils. But beneath this snowy facade lurked a horror show. Because wigs weren't washed. Not properly, at least. Cleaning one was a costly, laborious process, and many owners simply avoided it. Instead, they reapplied powder and perfume, layer upon layer, until the wig became a stiff, chalky helmet. Weeks, sometimes months, of sweat, oils, and dust would accumulate in the fibers. Imagine the stench of unwashed animal hair, soaked with human sweat and dust, then freshened up with a coating of flour. It was less vanilla sponge cake and more rotting barnyard. And then there were the inhabitants. Fleas and lice adored wigs. These creatures found in the dense curls the perfect breeding ground. Warm, dark, and rarely disturbed. People often complained of incessant itching beneath their elaborate headpieces, scratching away while pretending to remain dignified. Special scratching tools, called head scratchers, were even designed so one could relieve the itch without fully removing the wig. The parasites, of course, thrived regardless. Even worse, wigs sometimes hid infestations that spread to the scalp. Because heads were often shaved to better fit the wig, lice would move into the warm, wool-like environment of the wig itself. One wrong scratch could send a cascade of powdered dew, mist, and crawling vermin tumbling onto shoulders. In the candlelit glow of a courtly dance, it was possible to see tiny black specks darting across the pale fabric of collars. The powdered wigs also created another problem: smell. Powder was often made with flour or starch, organic materials that attracted rodents. Yes, rats and mice were known to gnaw at wigs, especially those stored in cabinets. Imagine the indignity of discovering your 100-guinea perruque chewed through by vermin, reeking of mildew and mouse droppings. And yet, wigs were not optional. They were mandatory markers of class, wealth, and authority. A man without a wig in court was as out of place as a king without a crown. Women's wigs grew to architectural proportions, towering a foot or more above the head, decorated with feathers, ships, or even miniature gardens. But no amount of artistry could conceal the smell of months-old sweat and powder fermenting together. Contemporaries wrote of the choking clouds wigs produced. Whenever a ballroom filled with powdered aristocrats, the air turned thick with a haze of starch and sweat. Servants sweeping afterward often complained of coughing fits, their throats lined with chalky residue. Imagine walking into such a hall, where every step released a puff of powder, mixing with the unmistakable tang of scalp sweat and vermin droppings. To mask this reality, scented oils were sometimes rubbed into wigs. Lavender, bergamot, and orange peel were favorites. But like perfumes on unwashed bodies, these aromas didn't eliminate the stench. They only sweetened it for a moment. One whiff of citrus might be followed by the sour smell of damp horsehair. And wigs, for all their glamour, carried a social penalty. Intimacy was nearly impossible. Leaning in close risked inhaling powder, catching lice, or simply gagging on the stale odor. Lovers might whisper sweet nothing, as through clenched teeth, desperate not to breathe too deeply. The wig, then, was the perfect metaphor for the century itself. Beauty on the surface, rot beneath. Behind the powdered elegance lay sweat, parasites, and decay, an invisible truth clinging to everyone from kings to clerks. But if wigs stank like personal cages of vermin and starch, the world outside was even worse. Step beyond the grand doors of any palace or townhouse, and you were greeted not by fresh air, but by streets overflowing with filth. Step outside the grand halls, away from the wigs and perfumes, and you'd think the air might be cleaner, fresher, safer. But the moment your shoes touched the cobblestones, you were swallowed by a wall of stench that no palace wall could keep out. The streets of 18th century Europe were rivers of filth. Picture narrow, uneven lanes lined with timber houses, their windows flung open not to let in fresh air, but to hurl out the day's waste. Chamber pots were emptied straight into the street, urine, feces, rotting food, all mixing into a rancid stew. The cry of "Gardaloo" in cities like Edinburgh was the only warning pedestrians had before a splash of human waste rained down from above. And even when you avoided the splash, you couldn't escape the smell. But human waste was only part of the picture. Horses were everywhere. They pulled carriages, hauled carts, carried riders through the city, and with every step they left behind steaming piles of manure. In a bustling city like London or Paris, thousands of horses meant thousands of daily reminders. Piles would bake under the sun, turning sour and sharp, or soak in rain, fermenting into a sludge that coated boots and clogged drains. Flies feasted, clouds of them, and the smell followed them wherever they went. Dead animals added their own notes to this orchestra of rot. Dogs, cats, horses too old to work, all might collapse in the streets, left to decay until carted off. Their bodies bloated in the summer heat, split open and poured out odors so vile that travelers described gagging as they passed. The smell of rotting flesh was part of the urban landscape, as unavoidable as church bells. And then there was the sewage. Cities lacked proper sanitation systems. Gutters overflowed with black, oily water, bubbling with waste and disease. When it rained, these channels spilled over, flooding roads with stinking filth that soaked shoes, hems of dresses, and the wheels of carriages. Imagine the collective odor of a city after such a storm. Horse dung, human waste, dead rats, rotting vegetables, all stirred together into one unbearable broth. Markets, for all their vibrancy, added their own odors. Butchers' stalls left entrails and blood pooling in the streets, attracting dogs, rats, and insects. Fishmongers dumped spoiled catch into alleys. Bakers and brewers at least offered sweeter smells, but even these were tinged with sour yeast and smoke, reminding you that freshness was a rare luxury. Now imagine this in summer. Heat intensified everything. Dung baked into bricks, urine steamed from the cobblestones, rotting meat oozed in the sun. The air was so thick with stink it clung to clothes, hair, and skin. Visitors often wrote about returning home with the stench of the city still clinging to them days after leaving. And yet, for city dwellers, this was normal. Children played barefoot in streets slick with waste. Housewives shook rugs into gutters. Vendors set up stalls inches from open sewage. The wealthy, of course, built higher walls, wider gardens, and retreated behind closed doors. But even they couldn't escape. The stink wafted over walls, rode on the breeze, seeped in through windows. A carriage ride was less about luxury and more about avoiding splashes from the gutters. This constant exposure created a strange paradox. People became desensitized. Complaints about smell existed, yes, but far fewer than you might expect. For many, the city's stink was just part of life, an invisible tax for the privilege of being near opportunity, power, and wealth. What shocked outsiders and travelers was, to locals, the scent of home. But in truth, the streets weren't just smelly, they were deadly. The odors were warning signs of disease lurking in the filth. Typhus, dysentery, cholera, all thrived in these conditions. Smell became synonymous with danger, a constant reminder that death was only ever a whiff away. So while the perfume-covered nobles danced in powdery clouds and the wig-wearing aristocrats scratched at their scalps. The streets below told the raw truth of the century. Europe was a continent drowning in its own filth, and every breath carried the weight of it. Yet even in this ocean of odors, one final, peculiar detail stood out. The very people who lived in palaces, who claimed to be closer to gods than men, carried their own stink with them, so strong it could be traced through the air. If the streets reeked of filth and the wigs crawled with vermin, one might expect that royalty, the pinnacle of wealth, refinement, and cleanliness, would have smelled better. But in truth, the opposite was often the case. Royalty carried with them something so infamous it had its own name: smell clouds. Imagine stepping into the Palace of Versailles in the 1700s. From afar, it glittered like a jewel. Gilded halls, mirrored walls, silk draperies, fountains spraying water into the air. But up close, the shine dulled. Versailles had notoriously few latrines, and courtiers relieved themselves in corners, stairwells, or behind curtains. Servants tried to cover the stench with incense and fresh herbs scattered along corridors, but the smell of waste seeped into everything: velvet, wood, even stone. Guests frequently complained of fainting not from awe, but from nausea. The royals themselves weren't immune. Bathing was rare. Many believed that water could seep into the body through the pores, carrying disease with it. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, reportedly bathed only a handful of times in his life. Instead of washing, he doused himself in perfume. The result? A human cloud of musk, sweat, and rot, masked by gallons of rosewater and ambergris. And yet, people admired it. Perfume wasn't just fragrance, it was status. To smell of amber, musk, or rare spices was to declare one's wealth. A king's scent entered a room before he did, not as a metaphor but as a reality. Courtiers wrote of following the perfume trail of nobles down hallways like invisible banners of rank. The irony was that beneath the musk, the same stench of bad teeth, dirty wigs, and unwashed skin lingered, creating a suffocating cocktail that clung to anyone who dared approach. Royal banquets were a special theater of odor. Picture endless tables piled with roasted meats, sugared fruits, and rich wines. Candles dripped wax onto golden plates. But as the feast dragged on, the air grew heavy: grease smoke, sweat from tightly corseted bodies, the sourness of spilled wine, and the unmistakable waft of halitosis from 100 noble mouths. By the end, the hall was less a place of pleasure than a furnace of stink. Servants rushing through the crowd left trails of their own, adding the smell of unwashed laborers to the royal perfume cloud. For those close to the throne, the smell cloud became part of daily life. Courtiers hoping to whisper secrets into a king's ear had to endure his breath, his unwashed robes, the powder of his wig drifting into their nostrils. For them, survival at court wasn't just about intrigue, it was about tolerance. To hold one's stomach was as much a skill as knowing when to bow. But the most telling detail of all is this: no one questioned it. The royal stink was accepted, even admired. If the king smelled this way, then surely this was the smell of power itself. To complain would be treasonous, to gag unthinkable. So courtiers smiled, bowed, and inhaled, even as their eyes watered. Travelers from abroad were less kind. Diaries and letters often describe European courts as dazzling to the eye but unbearable to the nose. Foreign ambassadors noted the irony that kings who claimed divine right carried themselves in clouds of sweat and rot. One English visitor wrote of Versailles, "One sees the heaven of mankind, but smells the stable of beasts." And so, the smell clouds of royalty became more than a curiosity. They were a symbol. Just as the perfume cloud disguised filth beneath, so too did the grandeur of monarchy mask decay. The royals lived like gods, but they smelled like men, sickly, sour, unwashed men. Their very bodies betrayed the truth that no amount of gold, no number of servants, no palace of mirrors could hide. In the 1700s, smell was the great equalizer. So if you picture the 18th century as a world of elegance, powdered beauty, and glittering palaces, remember the other reality. Step into that ballroom, and you're hit not with perfume, but with sweat. Lean in for a whispered secret, and you're met with rotting breath. Wander outside, and the city engulfs you with dung and sewage. Even a king's perfume could not conquer it. The 1700s were not just a century of revolutions, wars, and empires. They were a century of stink. A world where every breath told the truth, where the nose cut through the illusion, and where history itself smelled of sweat, sewage, and rotting teeth.